Piercing shrieks of a tortured human child reverberated through the Sire-Father's throne room as the sadistic Illyrian ruler prepared to extract Earth's secrets from a 12-year-old boy. 6 months earlier, Philip Collins, the lone survivor of a human colony ship, crashed onto Ilia Prime, the homeworld of the ruthless reptilian Haelor Empire. Imprisoned by the 8-foot Sire-Father and his cruel progeny, Sire Princes Xandar and Xikor, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy suffered heinous experiments as Illyrian scientists probed human limits. Now, chained before the obsidian throne, Philip faced the ultimate test. Reveal the location of Earth and your species' technologies, or embrace unimaginable agony, the Sire-Father hissed, nodding to Krendak, his barbarous chief torturer. The 7-foot behemoth Illyrian lumbered forward, neural whip crackling with malicious energy, capable of inflicting excruciating pain without physical wounds. As the lash rose to strike, Philip tensed his frail body against the imminent onslaught, deep blue eyes flashing with defiance. No matter the suffering, he would never betray Earth's billions to these heartless monsters. Humanity's fate hinged on his resolve never breaking. He could not let his world burn like his colony had. He silently vowed to endure until his last breath if needed, to protect the human race. The neural whip cracked across Philip's back. Xandar and Xikor, the battle-hardened Sire Princes, cringed at the human boy's agonized shrieks. Krendak, the chief torturer, lashed again and again, ripping screams from Philip's throat, the sounds echoing through the Sire-Father's obsidian throne room. But as the minutes dragged on, the child's cries changed, first quieting, then shifting into a low, guttural snarl, rumbling from deep in his heaving chest. The Sire-Father leaned forward on his throne, brow furrowed, as Philip's head slowly rose. The boy's eyes, once a deep ocean blue, now blazed a furious crimson. A roar of primal rage erupted from Philip. The small human lunged, his body surging with impossible strength. Krendak yelped as the boy tore the neural whip from the torturer's claws. The massive Illyrian scrambled backwards, but Philip, moving with blinding speed, cracked the lash across Krendak's face. Scales sizzled and burned as the energy-wreathed whip struck. Krendak flew backwards, crashing to the floor in a tangled heap. "Guards!" the Sire-Father bellowed, leaping to his feet. "Seize the human!" A dozen hulking Illyrians, each towering 7 feet tall and bristling with weapons, rushed forward. Philip blurred into motion, the neural whip humming and sparking. The first guard to reach him swung a jagged blade. The boy twisted aside. Armored fists hammered into the guard's side, shattering ribs. A second later, the neural whip coiled around the Illyrian's throat. Scales blackened and peeled. Smoke rose from charred flesh. The guard toppled, gurgling and thrashing. More guards lunged at Philip from every direction. The boy leapt and spun, dodging slashing swords and thrusting spears. He lashed out with the crackling whip in one hand, while the other struck with pile-driver force. Bones crunched, organs ruptured. The neural lash snaked out again and again, finding eyes, throats, gaps in armor. 7-foot-tall Illyrians crashed to the floor, spasming and howling. In seconds it was over. 12 guards sprawled dead or dying on the black stone. Emerald blood splattered the walls and pooled around Philip's bare feet. The human boy stood panting amid the carnage, his burning crimson eyes fixed on the Sire-Father as a cold grin split his young face. The Sire-Father slammed a clawed fist on his throne's hidden control panel. A grim smile split his scaled face as concealed doors whooshed open. His ultimate weapon against this impossible human child had arrived. 20 genetically engineered Illyrian warriors, the Sire Dread, each towering 9 feet tall, stomped into the throne room. Their bodies were encased head to toe in gleaming, near-impenetrable, exoskeletal combat armor. They carried the most advanced plasma rifles the Illyrian armories could produce. Targeting lasers played across Philip's blood-spattered form as the Sire Dread took aim. The Sire-Father's triumphant grin turned to slack-jawed horror a second later. Philip blurred into motion as the plasma bolts flew. Flashes of blue-white energy crackled through the throne room, but none touched the human boy. Philip reached the first Sire Dread before their fingers could tighten on triggers again. He leapt up and ripped the warrior's helmeted head clean off with a savage twist. The massive armored body toppled as Philip spun away. The remaining Sci opened fire once more. Plasma bolts stitching glowing holes across the throne room walls. Philip seemed to vanish, reappearing in the midst of the enemy squad. He tore into the hulking warriors, dismembering armored limbs and crushing helmets with his bare hands. Sprays of emerald ichor painted the human boy's snarling face as he rampaged through their ranks. Sire Princes Xandar and Zykor drew their plasma blades, determined to bring down this human demon. They charged across the throne room, shouting war cries to bolster their courage. Philip's crimson eyes locked onto them. The human boy shot forward, moving faster than any living creature should. Xandar swung his plasma blade. The glowing edge cleaved only air. A small fist, backed by impossible strength, crunched into the Sire Prince's chest, caving in his ribcage. Xandar's truncated scream cut off as he crumpled. Zykor lunged, stabbing for Philip's heart. The human child swayed aside. His hands clamped onto Zykor's sword arm. Exoskeletal armor shattered. Bones splintered. The plasma blade tumbled from Zykor's ruined hand. Philip wrenched the Sire Prince off his feet. There was a meaty crunch. Zykor's body landed in a contorted heap. His severed head rolled to a stop before the Sire Father. In moments, Philip stood alone amid the devastation. The butchered remains of the Sire Dread lay strewn across the floor. Xandar and Zykor's crumpled bodies cooled in growing pools of blood. Only the Sire Father still lived, huddled on his throne behind a crackling energy shield. The Illyrian ruler frantically worked his comm panel, shrieking orders to the orbiting war fleet. As the Illyrian warships unleashed a storm of plasma bolts, incinerating buildings and vaporizing screaming Illyrians by the thousands, Philip reached deep within himself. A power stirred, ancient and immense, rising from hidden depths. His eyes drifted closed as psionic energy surged through his mind. Across the void he locked onto Admiral Zardok's consciousness aboard the flagship. A connection formed, a bridge between human and Illyrian minds. Philip poured images through the link, raw and unfiltered. Zardok reeled in his command chair, claws gouging furrows in the armrests. Plasma explosions seared his thoughts. Illyrian civilians burned, bones blackening, flesh sloughing from skulls. Zardok's eyes flew open, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In the throne room, the Sire Father crouched behind his energy shield, Philip's crimson gaze boring into him. The human boy's lips curled. The shield generators whined, energy output spiking, containment fields failing. With a blinding flash, the shield exploded. Searing shrapnel scythed through the air. The Sire Father shrieked, throwing his arms up. Sparks showered his robes, setting them ablaze. Scales blistered and cracked. Philip strode forward, each step deliberate. He reached out, placing a hand on the Sire Father's head. The Illyrian ruler screamed. Agony exploded through his skull as Philip's mind ripped into his own, tearing through memories. The Sire Father writhed, Philip's grip like iron, talons sinking into his flesh. And still the human boy pushed deeper, peeling back the Illyrian's mind, seeking every scrap of knowledge to save his species. Philip released the Sire Father, the Illyrian ruler collapsing to the floor, gasping and twitching. The human boy closed his eyes, a blue nimbus of psionic energy swirling around him. His mind reached out, touching the thoughts of every Illyrian on the planet. Images poured into their consciousness, visions of the Sire Father's cruelty, his plans to invade Earth, to enslave and torture billions. Shock and revulsion rippled through the populace. People of Illyr, Philip's voice echoed in their minds, your leaders have deceived you. They seek to conquer and destroy, to inflict upon others the suffering you have long endured. But you have a choice. Rise up. Throw off the chains of oppression. Forge a new future, one of peace and cooperation with humanity. Together we can build a better world. Across the planet, in every city and settlement, Illyrians took to the streets. Roars of anger and cries for freedom shook the ground. They stormed government buildings, tearing down statues of the Sire Father, overwhelming soldiers and police who laid down their arms and joined the revolution. In the capital, a vast crowd surged towards the Sire Father's palace. Illyrians of all castes and clans united in purpose. The palace gates buckled and shattered under their assault. They poured into the throne room, a sea of scales and claws, to find Philip standing over the cowering Sire Father. The human boy, his eyes once more a deep blue, turned to face the crowd. "The Sire Father's reign is over," Philip declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "But his fate is not mine to decide. That right belongs to you, the people he has exploited and oppressed for generations. I ask only this. Show the mercy and compassion that he denied you. Prove that you are better than those who have wronged you." A hush fell over the gathered Illyrians. They looked to one another, centuries of pain and anger etched in their faces. Then, as one, they turned back to Philip and bowed, heads lowered in respect. A chant began, growing louder and louder until it shook the palace walls. "Philip! Philip! Philip!" The human boy raised his hand for silence. He turned to the Sire Father, who trembled on the floor, scales pale with fear. "You have a choice, Sire Father," Philip said, his voice calm but firm. "Surrender unconditionally and face trial for your crimes against humanity and your own people. Or defy the will of those you have wronged and face the consequences. What will it be?" The Sire Father looked from Philip to the crowd of Illyrians, their eyes hard and unforgiving. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. With a shaking claw he reached up and removed the golden circlet from his head, letting it clatter to the floor. "I surrender," he rasped, his voice broken and hollow. "I will answer for my actions. The fleet will stand down. All our forces will withdraw from human space. I only ask that you show mercy to my people. They were only following orders. The blame is mine alone." "The Sire Father will face justice," he announced. "But our work is just beginning. We must heal the wounds of the past and build a brighter future, and we will start by freeing every human held captive on this world." Cheers erupted from the Illyrians, their voices a thunderous roar. Philip closed his eyes again, his mind reaching out once more. He sensed them, the hundreds of human minds scattered across the planet, trapped in cells and cages, labs and factories. One by one he touched their thoughts, showing them visions of hope and deliverance. Philip's eyes opened, blazing with purpose. The Illyrians parted before him as he strode forward, a small figure against the backdrop of the shattered throne. There was so much to be done, so many challenges ahead. But for now, there was only the next step. Find the humans, bring them home, and let the galaxy tremble at what humanity had unleashed. Deep beneath Haelor Prime's surface, Philip's mind reeled as a desperate psionic cry pierced his thoughts. A group of human children, captives of sadistic Illyrian scientists, begged for rescue from unspeakable horrors. Images of sterile labs and cruel experiments flooded his consciousness. Rage ignited within Philip. He summoned Zalkir, his most trusted Illyrian ally. The reformed warrior towered over Philip, his scales gleaming obsidian. "Ready our strike team," Philip snapped, eyes blazing crimson. "We leave in 5 minutes." Zalkir nodded, clenching his fists. "We will make them pay for harming our human kin." Minutes later, Philip and a dozen heavily armed Illyrians crammed into a stolen military transport. As the craft plummeted into the planet's depths, Philip shared the children's mental map, guiding them to the hidden base. The transport lurched to a halt. Doors hissed open. Blinding lights and blaring alarms assaulted their senses. Genetically modified Illyrian soldiers, bristling with implants and armor, charged forward, plasma rifles shrieking. Philip and Zalkir moved as one, a lethal blur of human fury and Illyrian might. Plasma bolts sizzled past as they closed the distance, bones shattered, flesh seared. Illyrian blood sprayed the sterile walls. More soldiers poured into the corridor, a living tide of weaponized flesh. Philip reached out with his mind, finding the weak points in their defenses. Zalkir and the strike team surged forward, exploiting each vulnerability with ruthless precision. Automated turrets emerged from the walls, raking the corridor with searing light. Philip threw up a psionic shield, the air shimmering blue as energy bolts splashed against it. Zalkir lunged, ripping a turret from its housing and crushing it in his claws. They pushed deeper into the nightmarish facility, leaving a trail of sparking wreckage and twitching bodies. Each chamber held new horrors, dissected corpses, twisted abominations that were once human or Illyrian, failed attempts to fuse the two species into psionic killing machines. At last, they reached a massive blast door, the children's psionic signatures pulsing on the other side. The door groaned and buckled as Philip unleashed a telekinetic barrage, Zalkir and the others straining to pry it open. The door gave way with a screech of tortured metal. Philip stepped into the cavernous chamber, Zalkir at his side. A dozen containment cells lined the walls, each holding a frightened human child. Some were barely old enough to walk, others on the cusp of their teenage years. All bore the scars of invasive surgeries and brutal training. "What have they done to you?" Philip whispered, horrified and enraged. Dr. Zorax emerged, his white coat splattered with blood, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. The Illyrian scientist held a small device in his clawed hand. "Magnificent, aren't they?" Zorax purred, gazing at the captive children. "Vessels for the ultimate weapons, living bombs, primed to infiltrate and destroy. And now, I will give you a choice, Philip, savior of Ilir." Zorax's claw hovered over the device, a mad grin splitting his face. "Surrender or watch them burn." Philip's eyes blazed as he locked gazes with Dr. Zorax, the mad scientist's claw hovering over the detonation device. The captive children whimpered in their cells, their psionic cries of terror battering Philip's mind. "You're insane," Philip snarled, his fists clenching. "I won't let you murder these kids." Dr. Zorax laughed, a shrill, unhinged sound. "Insane? No, I'm a visionary. These children are the key to Illyrian supremacy, and if I can't have them, no one will." Philip's mind surged forward, a lance of psionic energy boring into Dr. Zorax's twisted thoughts. The scientist reeled, his mental defenses crumbling under the onslaught. Philip ripped through memory after memory, seeking the key to disarming the neurally linked explosives. There, a flash of the central control device, a tangle of wires and circuitry hidden deep within the facility's main lab, the only way to sever the link and save the children. Philip pulled back, his eyes refocusing on the physical world. "Zalkir with me, the rest of you hold this position. We end this now." Zalkir nodded, his plasma rifle whining as it charged. Together they sprinted for the lab, a tide of genetically modified Illyrian soldiers surging to meet them. Plasma bolts and psionic blasts filled the air, the stench of burnt scales and ozone choking the corridors. They fought like men possessed, Philip's telekinetic shields deflecting the worst of the barrage, while Zalkir fired with pinpoint accuracy, each shot reducing an Illyrian head to a smoking ruin. Bones shattered, and flesh tore as they carved a path of destruction through the enemy ranks. At last they reached the lab doors, the reinforced metal warped and scorched by the battle raging outside. Philip ripped them open with a thought, the screech of tortured steel echoing through the chamber beyond. Inside, a pulsing tangle of tubes and wires loomed, the central control device at its heart. A dozen different locks and fail-safes glinted in the harsh light, each one keyed to a specific DNA signature and keycard. "Zalkir, watch the door," Philip barked, his mind already racing through the possibilities. One by one he tore into the locks with his powers, the metal casings crumpling like tin foil. Keycards inserted themselves, pilfered from the corpses of Dr. Zorax's guards. A roar shook the chamber, a sound of primal fury and twisting metal. Philip spun, his eyes widening. Dr. Zorax stood in the shattered doorway, his body a grotesque fusion of Illyrian flesh and cybernetic enhancements. The war beast he had merged with towered over Zalkir, its mechanical claws dripping with the warrior's blood. "You're too late," Dr. Zorax hissed, his voice a metallic rasp. "The fail-safes are linked to my vital signs. Kill me, and the children die with me." Philip's mind raced, desperately seeking a solution. He couldn't let the children die, but he couldn't let this monster live. Zalkir struggled to his feet, his armor torn and his scales slick with blood. "Philip, go, I'll hold him off." As one they charged, a blur of human fury and Illyrian rage. Dr. Zorax met them head-on, his war beast's claws slashing and tearing. They fought with the strength of desperation, trading blow for devastating blow. In the end, it was Zalkir who struck the final blow, his plasma blade carving through the war beast's skull and into Dr. Zorax's twisted brain. The scientist convulsed, his death scream an electronic shriek. "Warning," a cold mechanical voice intoned. "Failsafe disengaged. Detonation in T-5 minutes." Philip and Zalkir shared a look of horror. They had minutes to evacuate the children and escape the blast radius. The race was on, and the fate of innocence hung in the balance. Time seemed to slow as the research facility erupted in a blinding flash, a thunderous shockwave hurling Philip, Zalkir, and the rescued children through the air like rag dolls. They crashed to the ground in a tangled heap, ears ringing and lungs burning from the scorched air. Philip staggered to his feet, his psionic shield flickering as it absorbed the brunt of the blast. Around him, the children whimpered and clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. "Is everyone all right?" Philip called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke and debris. Zalkir pushed himself up, green blood oozing from a gash on his forehead. "We're alive," he grunted, "but we need to move. That explosion will have attracted attention." Philip nodded, scanning the area with his psionic senses. He froze, his blood running cold as he detected a new presence in orbit above them. A fleet of Illyrian warships, their hulls bristling with weapons, hung in the sky like a swarm of angry hornets. "Attention, Philip, savior of Illyr," a voice boomed from the fleet's loudspeakers. "This is Admiral Zorax of the Haelor Imperial Navy. You and your followers are hereby charged with treason against the Empire. Surrender now, or face the consequences." Philip gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He knew that a direct confrontation with the fleet would be suicide and would likely result in massive casualties among the Illyrian population. He needed to find another way. "Admiral Zorax," Philip broadcasted his thoughts to the fleet, "I challenge you to single combat in accordance with Illyrian law. The winner will decide the fate of Illyr Prime and the Haelor Empire." There was a moment of silence, then a barking laugh from the loudspeakers. "You dare to challenge me, boy, I accept. Meet me on the steps of the ruined facility and we shall settle this once and for all." Philip turned to Zalkir, his eyes hard. "Get the children to safety, I'll handle this." Zalkir shook his head. "I should be the one to fight him. You're too important to risk." "No," Philip said firmly. "This is my fight. I started this and I'll see it through." He strode towards the ruined facility, his footsteps crunching on the rubble. The remnants of his Illyrian followers, those who had not defected to the old regime, formed a loose perimeter around the area, their weapons at the ready. Admiral Zorax emerged from a transport shuttle, flanked by a squad of elite Illyrian soldiers. He was a massive specimen, standing nearly 9 feet tall, his scales gleaming with battle scars. He carried a massive plasma axe, its blade crackling with energy. Philip said nothing, his eyes locked on Zorax as he reached out with his psionic senses, probing for weaknesses. He could feel the Admiral's confidence, bordering on arrogance but also a kernel of fear beneath the bravado. They circled each other, weapons at the ready. Zorax made the first move, his plasma axe whistling through the air in a brutal overhead chop. Philip sidestepped, the blade missing his head by inches. He retaliated with a psionic blast, but Zorax's mental defenses held firm. The Admiral pressed his attack, his axe a blur of motion as he hacked and slashed at Philip. The human boy ducked and weaved, his psionic reflexes barely keeping him ahead of the onslaught. He could feel himself tiring, his muscles burning with exertion. Zorax sensed his weakness, redoubling his efforts. His axe bit into Philip's shoulder, drawing a cry of pain from the human boy. Philip stumbled back, his left arm hanging limp at his side. The Admiral grinned, his fangs bared in a savage smile. "You're weak, human, just like the rest of your pathetic species. When I'm done with you, I'll burn your world to ash and enslave your people." Philip's eyes flashed red, rage surging through his veins. He reached deep within himself, tapping into the same primal power that had allowed him to defeat the Sire Father's guards. His psionic aura flared to life, a seething corona of crimson energy that crackled and snapped like a living thing. Zorgax faltered, his confidence wavering in the face of Philip's newfound strength. He raised his axe to strike, but Philip was faster. A blast of psionic energy caught the Admiral in the chest, hurling him backwards to crash into the rubble. Philip stalked forward, his eyes blazing with fury. Zorgax struggled to rise, but Philip was on him in an instant, his fists hammering into the Admiral's face and torso with brutal efficiency. Bones crunched and scales shattered under the onslaught, green blood splattering the ground. At last, Philip stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion. Zorgax lay broken and bleeding at his feet, his once proud form reduced to a shattered husk. The Admiral's soldiers, seeing their leader fallen, lowered their weapons in surrender. Philip turned to face the assembled armies, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. "The old regime is finished," he declared. "A new era dawns for the Haelor Empire, one of peace and cooperation with humanity. Let any who oppose this new order step forward and face me now." Silence greeted his words, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant crackle of burning debris. Slowly, one by one, the Illyrian soldiers knelt, their heads bowed in submission to their new leader. Philip let out a shuddering breath, the adrenaline draining from his system. He looked to Zulkir, who stood nearby with the rescued children, a look of pride and respect on his scaled face. As Admiral Zorgax's plasma axe descended in a brutal arc, Philip felt his strength waning, his psionic shield flickering under the relentless onslaught. The human boy's knees buckled, his vision blurring as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. Just as despair began to take hold, a sudden surge of psionic energy coursed through Philip's body, like a bolt of lightning reigniting a dying star. The rescued children, their minds linked in a powerful gestalt, poured their collective strength into Philip, bolstering his flagging reserves and fortifying his resolve. With a defiant roar, Philip thrust out his hand, unleashing a devastating psychic blast that caught Admiral Zorgax square in the chest. The Illyrian warrior flew backwards, his armor cracking and splintering under the impact. Zorgax crashed to the ground in a shower of rubble, his plasma axe clattering from his grasp. Philip pressed his advantage, his eyes blazing with renewed determination. As Zorgax struggled to regain his footing, the human boy reached out with his telekinetic powers, seizing control of the shattered boulders and debris that littered the battlefield. With a gesture, he sent the jagged projectiles hurtling towards the Admiral, pummeling him from every angle and keeping him off balance. The ground shook beneath the feet of the assembled armies, the air crackling with psionic energy as the battle raged on. Illyrian and human soldiers alike watched in stunned silence, their weapons lowered and their jaws agape at the display of raw power unfolding before them. Zorgax, battered and bleeding, lunged at Philip in a desperate bid to turn the tide. The human boy sidestepped the clumsy attack, his psionic senses guiding his movements with preternatural grace. As the Admiral stumbled past, Philip saw his opening. Charging forward, Philip gathered every ounce of psionic energy he could muster, focusing it into a single concentrated point at the end of his fist. The air around his hand shimmered and distorted like a mirage in the desert heat. With a final primal scream, Philip slammed his glowing fist into Admiral Zorgax's chest, the impact unleashing a shockwave that rippled outward, flattening the surrounding rubble and sending soldiers from both armies staggering. Zorgax's armor shattered like glass, the once mighty plates crumbling to dust under the force of Philip's blow. The Admiral collapsed to the ground, his eyes rolling back in his head as consciousness fled his battered body. Philip stood over his fallen foe, his chest heaving with exertion, his face streaked with sweat and grime. As the realization of his victory sank in, the Illyrian armies erupted in a deafening chorus of cheers and roars, their weapons thrust into the air in a gesture of triumph and allegiance. "Philip, Philip, Philip," they chanted, their voices rising in a crescendo that shook the very foundations of the ruined facility. The human boy turned to face his followers, exhaustion and triumph etched in equal measure on his youthful face. He raised a hand, calling for silence, and the assembled soldiers fell quiet, their eyes fixed on their new leader. "People of Haelor," Philip began, his voice ringing out across the battlefield, "today marks the beginning of a new era. An era of peace, of cooperation, of unity between our species. No longer will we be divided by fear and hatred, by the mistakes and atrocities of the past. From this day forward, humans and Illyrians will stand together, as allies, as friends, as brothers and sisters in arms." A cheer went up from the assembled Illyrian and human soldiers as Philip spoke, their voices ringing across the war-torn landscape. Zalkir grinned, his chest swelling with pride at the young human's words. A new era of peace and cooperation between their species, a chance to heal old wounds and forge a better future together. It was more than he had ever dared hope for. Philip raised a hand motioning for quiet. He opened his mouth to continue, but suddenly his words turned into a strangled gasp. His eyes widened, glowing a brilliant white as he clutched at his head and staggered backwards. "Philip!" Zalkir lunged forward, reaching for the boy, but an invisible force slammed into his chest, hurling him through the air like a rag doll. He crashed to the ground a dozen meters away, the breath knocked from his lungs. All around him, the assembled soldiers cried out in shock and fear as Philip collapsed to his knees, his small frame convulsing violently. The air around him shimmered and crackled with raw, psionic energy, tendrils of power lashing out in all directions. The rescued children screamed, their high-pitched voices laced with agony, as the psychic maelstrom tore through their minds. They clutched their heads, some falling to the ground, others clinging to each other in desperation. Zalkir staggered to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision swimming. He could feel the power radiating from Philip, a raging torrent of pure, uncontrolled psionic energy. The boy's mind was a supernova, burning itself out in a cataclysmic explosion of power. "His abilities have grown too strong," Zalkir muttered, gritting his teeth against the psychic onslaught. "His body can't contain it." He had to do something, had to find a way to help Philip before the boy's powers consumed him entirely. Zalkir closed his eyes, reaching out with his own mind, feeling for the edges of the psionic storm. The moment he made contact, agony lanced through his skull like a white-hot knife. He screamed, his knees buckling, but he forced himself to push through the pain, to delve deeper into the maelstrom. He could feel Philip's mind at the center of the storm, a brilliant blazing core of power. Zalkir latched onto it, pouring every ounce of his strength into creating a conduit, a way to siphon off the excess energy before it could burn Philip out entirely. The pain was unimaginable, a searing, all-consuming agony that threatened to shatter Zalkir's very being. He could feel his own mind beginning to buckle under the strain, his thoughts unraveling like frayed threads. But he couldn't give up, couldn't let Philip down. With a final, desperate surge of effort, Zalkir wrenched the bulk of the psionic energy back into Philip, forcing the boy's powers back under control. The feedback was instantaneous and devastating. Zalkir felt something snap inside his mind, a fundamental part of his being shattering like glass. His vision went white, then black, and he collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as his mind fragmented into a million jagged pieces. Beside him, Philip lay unmoving, his eyes closed and his face pale. The psionic storm had faded, but the damage had been done. The boy's body was battered and broken, his mind ravaged by the uncontrolled surge of power. Illyrian and human medics rushed forward, their faces grim as they loaded Philip onto a stretcher and carried him towards a waiting medical transport. The rescued children huddled together, their eyes wide and haunted as they watched their savior being taken away. The once triumphant armies of Haelor Prime stood silent and still, their heads bowed in grief and respect. The future they had fought so hard for, the dream of peace and unity that Philip had promised, now seemed to hang by a thread. As the medical transport lifted off, carrying Philip's unconscious form towards an uncertain fate, a sense of dread settled over the assembled soldiers. The battle had been won, but at what cost? And with their leader fallen, Who would guide them through the challenges that lay ahead? Only time would tell, but for now all they could do was wait and pray that Philip would somehow find the strength to return to them, to lead them into the bright future he had envisioned. The fate of two species, the destiny of an entire galaxy, now rested on the shoulders of one small broken human boy. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.